Hi, my name's Elizabeth Mills. I'm a PhD researcher at the School of Science and Engineering at Dundee University, and my research falls exactly in between two completely different disciplines: marine biology and engineering.
Marine biology is the study of all of the creatures that decide to spend their lives in the ocean.
But engineering is all about building structures, materials and systems. So when do they overlap? Well, every time we put a structure or material into our oceans.
We place a lot of structures and materials into our oceans, and at some point every single one will have marine life growing on it. When you get marine life growing on man-made materials compared to natural ones, we call this biofouling, and that is what I study every single day.
My research is specifically trying to tackle one of the issues that comes with biofouling, and that is marine invasive species. Marine invasive species are species that live outside where they usually live. They get around the world mainly by hitchhiking on the bottom of boats and end up in places where they usually aren't. The problem comes is because marine invasive species also cause economic and ecological harm. They're entering a new world, basically. The species that they live with have never ever had to live with this new species before, and that can sometimes lead to problems. It can mean that the species that has come over and been introduced can outcompete, they can eat the foods that the native species would usually eat. Some species can even grow really fast and will grow over the top of native species, and that means they will be smothered and won't survive. There are a number of different issues that can come about with the introduction of a marine invasive species.
In fact, invasive species is thought to be the second biggest threat to global biodiversity, second only to climate change. And in fact, this problem is predicted to get worse with climate change. So we need to do all that we can to try and help solve this problem now before it gets any worse.
And that is why my research is looking at ways that we can reduce the settlement of these species, reduce their establishment and reduce the risk that they are going to have a negative impact on our own native biodiversity. As a marine biologist, I noticed this issue, and I also noticed that we found a lot of marine invasive species on man-made surfaces. And a lot of them were in harbours, and that's because the main way that they get around the world, like I said earlier, is hitchhiking on ships. So the first kind of environment that a ship will be put into, that these species experience, is a harbour, and that's often where you then find them. So given that they like to grow on man-made structures a lot, I wanted to understand more about that. So as a marine biologist, I decided to learn engineering as well. I went from having a marine biology undergraduate to then gaining a master's in materials engineering and now a PhD in civil engineering, all because I wanted to learn about both sides, about the marine side, about the engineering side, so that we can tackle this problem by combining the two knowledges of these disciplines together. I'm using the knowledge I've learnt from these two disciplines to develop a new type of concrete, because concrete is the most used material in our oceans, to try and reduce the amount of invasive species that settle. But how is this possible? Well, like most things in science, it's a lot of experimenting, it's a lot of trial and error, and a lot of possible failures. And I don't know yet if my concrete has worked, if it has been successful in reducing marine invasive species. But the idea behind making this concrete, the idea that potentially means it's going to work, is absolutely fascinating, and it is based purely on the amazing and really fascinating world of how a lot of these marine species reproduce.
The idea behind what I'm trying to do with my PhD is based on the fact that marine organisms have a choice, or are very choosy. The most biofouling organisms are actually attached to where they live. They cannot move from that spot, and that's a problem when you want to, reproduce. You don't want all your children in exactly the same spot as you. So for that to happen, you have to have a mobile life stage some point in their life cycle. And for a lot of these creatures, they do something called spawning, which is when they release either their reproductive cells or their tiny children, and in their kind of microscopic, teeny tiny forms, into the water column, and they become planktonic, which means that they move with the currents and move through the ocean. But during the end of that planktonic life stage, many species actually have the ability at this teeny tiny level to seek out their own materials. They can choose where they settle. They will land and be able to tell the material properties of where they're settling. Is it rough? Is it smooth? What chemicals are in there? And each species has its own little preference for what it does and does not like. Isn't it amazing that at this tiny life stage they have the ability to take in, all of this complex information about where they're going to live? But it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're only going to live in one place for the rest of your life, it's a really, really important decision. And that is what I am trying to use to help stop marine invasive species spread.
So my job is to basically be an absolutely terrible real estate agent to these marine invasive species, and to try come up with a material where they just do not want to live. I'm also trying to make it as cheap and as easy to implement within industry as possible, because the quicker we can make changes to the materials that we put into the sea, the more difference it's going to have in hopefully reducing marine invasive species if one of the concretes I come up with is successful. And I'm also making sure that they are non-toxic so that we don't harm any organisms or marine creatures when we put things into the sea.
So, for the last 3 years of my PhD, that is what I have been trying to do. I have been searching harbours. I have been learning all about the creatures that live there, that grow on man-made surfaces, identifying them, then taking what I've learned, putting that into testing concrete, designing new concretes, and putting that in the ocean.
And what I'm really excited about the study as well is whether it's successful or not. I have designed a study that really encompasses both engineering and marine biology. It's going to be a stepping stone for people to learn to gauge what is and isn't working and move forward from this and further scientific research into the future, so that we can begin to tackle this problem, begin to reduce the threat of marine invasive species and help protect our native biodiversity. And I just love that what I do every single day means that hopefully it will make a difference. And that is just why I absolutely love my job as a researcher.